So welcome everyone to Stemming the Tide of Aquatic Invasive Species. My name is Rachel DeVos and I'm Director of Policy and Advocacy here at the AUMA. Between domestic fish being dumped into stormwater ponds and invasive mussels moving westward through Ontario and Manitoba towards Alberta, municipalities are increasingly concerned about aquatic invasive species. Based on a 2013 member resolution, AUMA advocated for legislative amendments to provide the enforcement authority needed to prevent an invasion of mussels into the province. And this last spring, amendments were made to Alberta's Fishery Act, which the spring before in 2015, amendments were made to Alberta's Fishery Act, which require mandatory inspection of boats and watercraft that are transported into our province, and Kate will be talking more about that in just a moment. At the request of AUMA and AMDNC, the Saskatchewan Urban Municipalities Association and the Saskatchewan Association of Rural Municipalities are also advocating for the Government of Saskatchewan to establish mandatory inspection stations and increase monitoring for invasive mussels in time for the summer 2016 boating season. And we're really pleased to have representatives of both SUMA and SARM participating on the webinar today, along with representatives of AMDNC. So great to have everybody here working together. And with that, we are really pleased to be working so closely with the Government of Alberta on this issue, and Kate Wilson, who is the province's Aquatic Invasive Species Specialist, and who can be seen in this picture flexing her good mussels, not the invasive mussels. So she's, as I said, she's this Aquatic Invasive Species Specialist with the Fish and Wildlife Policy Division of Alberta Environment and Parks. Or not in Alberta Environment, oh yeah, Alberta Environment and Parks, just not forestry anymore. Kate has worked on aquatic invasive species issues and management for the past several years, both in Idaho helping to implement a prevention program and in Florida during graduate school. She's excited to lead the development of Alberta's provincial aquatic invasive species program to protect the freshwater resources and all the critters that live there. So I'll turn things over to Kate. And as I said, if you have questions throughout, just type them in and we'll get them to them at the end.
Okay, welcome everyone. I'm excited to be here, so thank you for the invitation and the interest, as always. I do have a fair amount of slides, so I'm going to go kind of quickly. So yeah, if you do have questions, just go ahead and type them in and we'll get to them at the end. So this is my favorite photo to begin. It is just a year now that we've had these mandatory inspections, so whenever I see this sign, I still get very excited. And I do also want to share, I was just in Saskatchewan last week at the Saskatchewan Association of Watersheds conference, where they invited me to speak, and I told them I came to terrify them, but then to give them hope. And that is exactly, I hope what happened, because this is a really scary issue that really binds us together. There's a lot of things that we can do to work together. But it's important in a situation like this where there's invaders coming in all kinds of pathways, and sometimes it feels kind of depressing, that there is hope. And really 2 years ago we didn't have a program, so it's an important thing to keep in mind. So I'm going to go ahead and get started here. So I think we all know this, but let's just be on the same page about what we're referring to when we talk about aquatic invasives. I still get a fair amount of questions about, is blue-green algae an invasive species? No, because it is native, unfortunately, and it is actually like in the sediment of the mud. So it doesn't meet the criteria for an invasive. Invasives are non-native to the watershed, and I do clarify watershed because species like Didymo, for example, rock snot, fun to say, not fun to spread. It is native to certain parts of Western Canada, but expanding in range in places where it really can do a lot of damage. So I would also look at species on the landscape like mountain pine beetle. So that is also native to certain parts of Western Canada, but where it has expanded, creating a lot of economic and environmental hardship. Generally, because they're not from here, these species are not going to have a natural predator or anything to really keep them in check. So that's why invasives tend to really get the upper edge over native species. And then the global definition that is used is these species have to pose a risk to the economy, the environment, or human health. And species like zebra and quagga mussels that we're going to talk about a fair amount today really do pose a threat to all three of those things. So where do they come from? People move around more than they ever have before, and they buy all kinds of stuff from all over the world. So this graphic shows you the global shipping routes across the world, and you can see places like the Great Lakes where a lot of those ships are going. It totally makes sense why that becomes the initial introduction site, because these big ships come across the ocean a lot of the time from freshwater ports, and they enter the Great Lakes, they release their ballast water, and in that water are fish, invertebrates like mussels, plant fragments, parasites, disease that are still viable after that long trip across the ocean. This also would include just people buying things on the internet and trade being more vibrant than it ever has before. With trade comes hitchhikers, unfortunately. So there are efforts on the federal side to really work on this ballast water issue, and hopefully that means over time we will see less species being introduced to North America. So invasive mussels, I just really want to make this point that they are the perfect poster child for really raising awareness with the public and stakeholders about this issue, because they really do have impacts on so many things. And the economic driver is really big as well. So we're not only concerned about mussels, it's just that they really scare the crap out of everyone. So it's a good place to start and really build on it from there. So why do we care so much about these mussels? Well, they can live up to 30 days out of the water. So that means, let's say you left Lake Havasu, little summer bird you, and you had mussels on your boat. You could actually drive in the right conditions, as far as you really wanted to in a month, right, and back, and stop at lakes and reservoirs on the way, and those mussels would still be viable on your boat. So that is a really scary prospect, and it's a really long time for any aquatic species to live out of water. They're filter feeders, so the ecological impacts are huge. That means that they filter out the nutrients from the water, which means the fish, and then really the entire food web over time is greatly impacted by these critters being there. And like most aquatic invasives, there aren't a lot of great control options should we have a problem. So should we ever have a detection, we need to put our effort now into the emergency, which is prevent them before they get here. And then finally, I don't really spend too much time talking about what they look like, what colors, how big, because the fact is, if you see any mussel or clam that is attached to anything, a boat motor, a dock, a piling, a rock on the beach, the fact that it's physically attached means that it's an invasive species. So no native mussels can physically attach like that. So again, if you're at a gas station, you see a boat pull up, there's attached mussels on the boat, you're going to memorize our hotline number and report it right away. This is a graphic from the state of Idaho, so I am a little biased because I did come from there. But they have a really aggressive prevention program, and this map shows you of the 60,000 boats that were inspected in Idaho last season, how many of them came from different places. So every U.S. state, every Canadian province is represented by those dots. People are traveling with their boats more than ever before, and if you look at all the dots in Canada, where are most of them? Here in Alberta. I believe that most of these are probably snowbirds who either take their boats down south or buy a boat in the States while they're there and bring it back up and were inspected in Idaho. So that's pretty scary, and it is the #1 source of introductions for things like mussels and even plants. Plants can hitchhike on boats really well. So I'm just going to keep going on that note. So we know the pathway in which mussels are going to get here are most likely going to be boats, which I think is more important that we focus on the pathway itself, the boat, instead of making sure that every public citizen knows how to identify a zebra mussel. And a couple examples here for you. So this is a reservoir in Kansas. They found zebra mussels in 2003, and they probably thought at this point, you know, well, that sucks, but it's livable. They're just kind of under the rocks and here and there. But within just 3 years, they draw the water down again, and you see these adult size, you know, about the size of your thumbnail, attached to every single substrate imaginable. And you know, one zebra quagga mussel can filter up to 1 liter of water per day, so that's a lot of filtering that's happening. And also, one quagga mussel can have up to 1 million offspring a year. So the spread is really exponential once you have a detection and a viable population. So it really helps to use some economic drivers to get the attention that this issue deserves, and we have done that. So you know, if there are folks from Saskatchewan on the phone, I would really encourage you to try to do something like this, because it really gets the attention of decision makers and stakeholders who really have a role to play in this issue. So if you look at all the impact categories that would have impacts should a mussel introduction happen, we're looking at everything from irrigation infrastructure to municipal intakes, any diversions for industry, impacts to recreational fishing, and even things like decreases in property values. We figure we're looking at over $75 million a year. So that means you take that number, which I believe is conservative, and then you compare it to what it will cost to get a really robust prevention program in place. So right now we're spending just under $2 million a year for boat inspections, monitoring, response planning, and education. So really it's a drop in the bucket compared to what we would be spending should we not do anything at all. And this is very fortunate that I just came across this report that was just published last year, and the province of Ontario actually took a look at what they have been spending. So they've been living with this problem for about 25 years now, and ironically, their estimate is between $75 and $91 million. So I can't make this stuff up. That $75 million, it's a real figure, and I would say that just based on the irrigation infrastructure that we have in Alberta, that, like I said, that probably is a conservative estimate. Okay, so this is a really depressing map, which is why I covered it with all kinds of things to try to detract from how depressing it is, but I will explain it to you. So the red dots are zebra mussels, the green dots are quagga mussels, the yellow dots are where they coexist together, and the purple ones we probably don't have time for, but you can ask me if you're really curious later. So in 1989, the first zebra mussels were found in Lake St. Clair in the Great Lakes and really spread. So all those red dots really started happening from there to about the year 2000. A lot of the time they are spread by these trailered watercraft, in fact the majority, but also I'd like to point out just the river drainages. So typically they don't see mussels attaching in river systems because the flow is too great. They can't really attach that well, but the rivers provide an excellent conduit for them to move downstream to reservoirs and lakes downstream. So by 2000, the U.S. government had set up a group called the 100th Meridian, which was sole purpose was to prevent the mussels from going across that invisible line to the west. And unfortunately, they need to change their name now, but they did find quagga mussels in Lake Mead right outside of Las Vegas in 2007. It was so bad when they found them that they had probably been there for at least a couple of years. And then you see all those green dots in the southwest U.S. have happened within the last 10 years. So mostly quagga mussels in the southwest U.S. And we really thought when we started in 2013 that this would be our biggest threat, that all those folks who go down south from Alberta and come back would be the most likely source for introductions. Now, if there's one good thing to say about the 2013 detection of zebra mussels in Lake Winnipeg, it is this. We would have focused our efforts pretty much solely on the U.S. border because that is all the information that we had. That, you know, the southwest U.S. is the #1 you know, kind of source of where these boats are coming from. And so when Lake Winnipeg happened, we really ramped up our efforts on the eastern border as well, and really awesome that we did, because it turns out that the eastern provinces are actually a bigger threat right now to Alberta than the southwest U.S., and I'll tell you more about that in a minute. I just put all those headlines on there because that's what we're seeing coming out of Manitoba. And lucky for you, I actually have some photos when I got a visit a couple weeks ago. I would like to draw your attention to the blue star. So the happy thing of this really depressing map is we have excellent network with the 5 mussel-free states below us and BC as well. So when boats come through their inspection stations that have mussels on them, we're always notified. Oftentimes those states will even take care of the boat, decontaminate it for us, and the communication and the partnerships have really improved vastly in the last couple of years. So that is my happy face on the really depressing slide. We also have a lot of regional and international groups who are focusing on this issue as well. They tend to focus more on mussels, but some are broader aquatic invasives, and this map just kind of represents those areas. So we have one of the most active groups is called the Pacific Northwest Economic Region, PNWR, and that's all the green. And then there's this 100th Meridian Columbia River Basin that is the brown. And then there's a couple of other groups as well that are a little more localized. So we participate in all of these things, and it's really great to see those kinds of international partnerships. So let's talk about Lake Winnipeg. This is a couple of photographs that the coordinators over there shared with me, and I wanted to share with you. So this is a substrate in 2013 before, well, when they had first found zebra mussels and pulled out after a couple months. And then this second one is just from last season. So you can see how fast those mussels have encrusted the substrate, and you tend to find this where you get kind of a base layer, and then all these little babies will colonize on top of the adults, and it just gets really thick really fast. So that was from the coordinators, like I said, and this is a rope. So ropes are not really a hard substrate, are they? But yet you're still finding like solid attachment like that. So I thought that was pretty awful and also impressive and good to show people. But then I went there for an International Aquatic Invasive Species Conference just a couple weeks ago, and the Manitoba folks were nice enough to take us up to Gimli Harbor. So that is one of the bays that was actually treated for mussels with potassium chloride in 2014. And of course, the mussels had already spread outside of the bay, so now they're facing some really big problems. And they told us, when we're going to get up there, it's still winter at Gimli, so you may not see any mussels at all. And we thought, oh, okay, well that would be a bummer. We get there, we're like, oh yeah, it doesn't look too promising. But then we found this boat. So this is a commercial angler's boat, and you can see the water line. Down below the water line is solid thick with mussels. And let me just show you, like, this is a huge boat. That is a lot of crustacean for one season. So this boat would have gone in about June and would have been pulled out in October. So that's what, less than 6 months, and you have this kind of attachment. And just to zoom in a little bit, all age classes, and you even see this photo on the left where you have an adult, and then look at all those babies on top of it. There's probably 50 mussels in that one little area. So like I said, terrifying. This is what I showed in Saskatchewan last week as well. And I mean, it's a really scary, terrifying prospect for us. Okay, let's switch gears. I'm just really going to quickly talk about the second most likely source of introductions for aquatic invasives and some of the other species that we're really concerned about. So starting in the left-hand corner, Eurasian water milfoil, still not found in Alberta. This is a very hardy rooted aquatic invasive plant that can grow from the bottom of the water all the way to the surface in one growing season, so in one summer. And one little leaflet, so just like you see on the screen there, kind of separate, can break off from the stem, sprout roots, and start a new colony. So in Idaho, this is how I got into aquatic invasives, because they had thousands of acres of Eurasian water milfoil, and really hard to get rid of once it's established because, like I said, every leaflet. So imagine you have a dock and now it's totally surrounded by Eurasian water milfoil. That means that every time you bring your boat in and out, you're chopping up those fragments and they're going everywhere. So I'm really glad we haven't found this plant in Alberta, but we certainly need to continue to be vigilant about it. And it really looks a lot like our northern milfoil, so I'd really like to see us do more aquatic plant surveying. Under that we have flowering rush. It is circled because we do have it in Alberta in a fair amount of locations at this point. That photo was taken at Lake Isle, which unfortunately has the worst infestation in the province, hoping to do something about that this summer. Under that is the Prussian carp. So this is essentially a wild goldfish that looks like a goldfish, albeit bigger than you would expect, and silver. So it's not gold, it's silver. Found now from the U.S. border to the Red Deer watershed, but no further north that we know of. This fish is doing exceptionally well in Alberta waters and has not been reported in any other jurisdiction. So really strange situation on that one. We'll talk about it a little more later. This one in the middle, that is a northern snakehead, the most aggressive freshwater predator fish in the world. Sold often at like TNT markets. They'll sell them alive as a delicacy in some cultures. This is no longer allowed in Alberta. The entire species, or sorry, the entire family of snakehead has now been banned for import and sale. It can actually breathe air and live out of water for multiple days and can slither across land to get to other water bodies. So really want to avoid any risk of introduction for a species like that. Moving up to the right-hand corner on the top, that is the illustrious jumping silver carp, so often called Asian carp in the media. There's a lot of Asian carp. These are technically silver. This is a fast growing, long-lived species that can reach 100 pounds. So no predator is going to eat a 100-pound fish. And just look at the density. So they're not sure why exactly they jump, but it definitely has to do with the vibration of the motor in the water. So you'll just like be out for your serene, you know, Sunday boat ride, and then all of a sudden not one fish is jumping, but like thousands of fish are jumping up to 10 feet in the air. And a lot of you have heard this before, but this particular photo from the Illinois River is a redneck fishing derby where it's about the best injury to a human actually wins the entire derby. So that's funny, but not something that we would ever like to see happening in Alberta. Under that, real quick, we have the round goby. So this is a really good example of why introducing a predator to deal with a problem isn't always so simple. This is actually a native predator of the zebra mussel. Came in the same way that they did with the ballast water of these big cargo ships, and now are the most prolific fish in the Great Lakes. So that would suggest that they're very well fed, but not actually controlling the mussel population because they still have a lot of mussels in the Great Lakes. And finally, under that, we have this black bullhead. So this is a new addition to my list. I added it because last summer we found a pond up near Fort McMurray that had about 1,000 of these guys in it. And luckily, it was the best case scenario for a aquatic invasive species introduction because it was a contained, man-made, stocked trout pond. No native fish and surrounded by public land. So I believe this is our first successful eradication of aquatic invasives in the province. So how did these kind of species get here? Well, intentional release. So these would all be situations probably where someone actually deliberately dumped their aquarium, moved a fish from one water body to another, from out of province into Alberta, or planted a plant that then became invasive. So I'm focusing on goldfish here because all of these photos, except the guy dumping the aquarium, I promised I wouldn't let that happen for a photo. They all came from Alberta. So the picture on the left, that is from St. Albert. So there's some big fish in that picture. The one on the upper right-hand corner, that's from High River last summer. And you'll see there's a lot of difference in coloration. That's because the longer the goldfish are reproducing, they are losing their color in the wild. So they're still all the same species probably. Under that, this is kind of how this whole conundrum started, was the 4 age classes in the bottom photo. That's from a stormwater pond in Fort McMurray. So you see the smallest age class, you can barely see it, half the size of your pinky finger, all the way up to Granddaddy Goldie, I call him, which is the size of a dinner plate. No kidding. So if goldfish are surviving in the wild in a place as cold as Fort McMurray in a non-aerated pond, and obviously living through the winter, obviously having babies, they could survive anywhere in the province, no problem. So I can't tell you exactly what the impact of goldfish would be if they make it to our rivers and lakes, but I know it's not good. Aquariums are notorious for having diseases and parasites that, obviously wouldn't be found in the natural waters. We also know that goldfish eat other fish eggs, they eat plants, they eat plankton. They would compete for food for a lot of our native fish species. So also I like to point out that it's goldfish today, but if people feel like this is an acceptable behavior, then it could be snakeheads tomorrow. It could be anything. And it's kind of weird where we're finding the bulk of these introductions. They tend to be pretty affluent, urban stormwater ponds. And the problem with this is the stormwater ponds are often connected to streams, rivers, and lakes. So it's the connectivity that really is an issue, along with the public behavior. So if we want to start doing something about this issue, which I do, we need to really make sure that people aren't just going to reintroduce the fish again. Okay, so my terror tactics are over, and I'm going to switch real quick to program highlights. Again, a lot of you probably know a lot of this, but I do have some new information as well. So our program is based on 5 program elements I can count, and really there's only 2 FTEs and 1 project position. So we beg, borrow, and steal people from across ministries, from outside of government to help us deliver our programs. So first, education and outreach is a major part of what we do, and the Clean Drain Dry campaign focuses mostly on, well, all on boats, of course, but really focuses on the fact that inspections are mandatory now and that there are consequences if you don't stop. And really, it's not just education, it's about changing public behavior. So I want to see a day where you pull your boat out of the water, and if you don't walk around it, make sure all the weeds are gone, make sure the drain plug's pulled, and the boat is completely dry before you launch it again, you're going to get some heck from your peers. They're going to say, oh man, you left the lake and you got weeds all over your trailer. That's awful. And I think that creating that social norm like recycling or not littering is really what people need to know. Their personal actions can prevent this spread. I did put in a 30-second clip here. I'll show you this one, but I'll probably skip the next one just because I am probably being too slow. So we've been working with Michael Short on these ads, and this is like a 30-second for mainstream TV and online viewing. Yeah, so real short, but I think pretty effective. I'm going to start to do more with law enforcement on site so that people understand that there is a consequence if they don't stop. And we figure we reached 2 million people last year with mainstream advertising. So the word is really getting out, and that is great. So our second campaign is to address that second source of introductions, which is intentional release. This would include things like people dumping their aquariums, planting terrible plants like flowering rush, and even, stretching your mind a little bit here, there are a lot of fish that are sold live in TNT markets and other specialty food markets. And so we want to make sure that that isn't a source of introductions as well. We have gotten kind of creative about what we're doing, and because the goldfish issue is really taken off and is admittedly a really challenging thing to deal with, we thought, well, why don't we come up with something that would encourage people to do the right thing with their fish. So we're like, okay, you want to get rid of your fish, then you can give it away. You could, try to sell it, I guess. Take it back to the store. That's always a good option. Sometimes they will take fish back. But then if you really don't know what else to do, you should not release it into the wild, but you should probably kill it and put it in one of these nice biodegradable fish caskets. I would also say that if a fish dies of natural causes, you know, when I was a kid, we would just flush it down the toilet, and I grew up in the country, so it was okay because there's a septic system. But in the cities, we really don't want people to be flushing dead fish down the toilet, because whatever killed your fish goes with it. And while our treatment systems are really great at removing, you know, the big stuff, probably not going to get those microscopic disease and parasites that actually killed your fish. Real quick on monitoring, so before 2013 we had no aquatic invasive species monitoring in the province, and in the last 3 years have really been able to get an average of between 50 and 60 water bodies monitored for mussels, let me be clear. So they do these plankton tows, the guy with the net, and then in the corner there you see the PVC pipe that's a substrate available for citizens to hang off their dock and just check, make sure there's no adult attachment. So there's kind of two different types of mussel monitoring. And you can see on the map there's a ton of partners who are helping us with this monitoring. Monitoring is a challenging and expensive endeavor to undertake, so we actually use our water quality monitoring folks. So they'll go out and, while they're already out there on the boat taking samples, they'll do the plankton tows and check the substrate. So that's been a really great partnership. In the future though, I'd really like us to look at plants, look at fish, and not just mussels. So there was reference to the amendments that were made in the Fisheries Act last year, and I just quickly wanted to go over the highlights of that. So we went from having 2 prohibited species in the province to 52, and these are listed at the very back of the Fisheries Act on the last page. And kind of interesting, I've never really seen it done this way, where you actually have like plants listed in the Fisheries Act, but there was really nowhere else to put it. So right now that list is quite long, and the challenge will now be to make sure that we have compliance, and that would start with making sure that stores aren't selling any of the species on the list. So I have a really nice version of the list that if you're interested, I'd be happy to share with you. You go to a store, you see them selling a snakehead of any kind, that's something that we would really want to know about. And you can't import it, you can't transport it, you can't sell it, of course, and you can't even have it. So an individual that has a snakehead is now breaking the law. The meat behind the amendments was really to make the inspections mandatory. What's the point of going to all this effort and expense if not everyone is stopping at the stations? And when it was voluntary, we had between 40 and 50% compliance. So I just don't feel like that's good enough. So it has increased a lot with the education campaign and with people just starting to understand, oh, it means me too with my kayak. It means commercial haulers. It means government staff. Anyone who has a boat has to stop when they pass a station. If we do find something in the wild, we have enhanced quarantine provisions, so we could, shut down launches, deal with boats on the water should we ever have a detection, especially for mussels. But it also gives us authority to regulate things in the future should we have the ability, such as the pet and aquarium trade. So should we be allowing fish and other species to come in and be sold to the public if we know that they pose a threat to our native species? Probably not, I would say. Really quick on the enforcement angle, so we've been really creative about how we're going to enforce these rules. So most of our fish and wildlife officers, our conservation officers, they're not on the highways that often, right? They're out in the bush, they're out on the lake. They're doing a lot of important stuff that doesn't take them on the highways. So now we have transport officers at the weigh scales that are appointed under the Fisheries Act just to enforce this legislation, and now we just got traffic sheriffs appointed as well, and the RCMP or ex officio authority too. So that means that those 3 entities are going to be on the highway way more than our conservation officers and fish and wildlife, so hopefully we'll have some really good enforcement this year. Brand new, so you're actually the first to hear about this. We have some regulations that were passed just about 3 weeks ago now. So as of April 1st, and obviously we have a lot of educating to do about this, but we're introducing a new rule that all watercraft that are being transported must have the drain plug out. So we're going to see in the media this year with our clean, drain, dry messaging will also be a pull the plug. And unfortunately this whole euthanasia topic came up recently, and people were like, you know what that means, right? And I'm like, no, 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 you frame it right, you put the boat on there, everyone's going to know we're talking about the drain plug. It's fine. So that is to make sure that water isn't moving between water bodies or between provinces or states, because water can carry the microscopic larvae from mussels, whirling disease, VHS, all kinds of things, even plant fragments that are, you know, hard to catch. So we want to make sure that boaters are coming in, they're also taking some responsibility by making sure the boat is drained. If you find aquatic invasives in a wild state, so in the water, you do have to report them now. And we are creating a possession license, so if we have a collector of snakeheads who has, you know, had them for 20 years and has invested thousands of dollars, and we know that he understands the risk, there's no way he could like sell them, give them away, we could potentially work with him to set some conditions about keeping them. Federal Fisheries Act also passed regulations in June of last year, which means finally we might get some help with the U.S. border. So all those snowbirds returning home, you know, they have to stop at the border anyway. Can they not say, you know, inspections are mandatory in the province, or even do an inspection themselves? So we're really working on that angle. And inspections. So the most visible part of our program is definitely the boat inspections. This is a risk map. So the first question you're asked when you come through a station is, has your boat been, well, where has your boat been in the last 30 days? And if you've been outside of that friendly green zone, then we would consider it to be a high risk. That doesn't mean anyone gets in trouble, or really even that it takes much longer. It's just that we have to be more thorough about making sure there's no standing water, there's no you know, crusty stuff that could potentially be like small mussels or anything like that. So all of our stations have hot water wash units. That's all we use. No chemicals or anything, and we can usually take care of stuff right there on site. So last year, well, first of all, we went from 2 summer student crews in 2013, just on the weekends in the southern portion of the province, to piloting the use of weigh scales in 2014 at 4 sites. I think we inspected about 4,000 boats in 2014, and then last year really ramping up to 12 inspection stations. This made Alberta a leader in the prevention of aquatic invasives across Canada, and we inspected 21,500 boats. That's a lot more than anyone expected. And we can make our own kind of boater origin map now. So this shows 42 states and 7 provinces. That's where boats are coming from. We intercepted 11 mussel-fouled boats, and every single one of them this last year came from Manitoba or Ontario. So like I said, the one positive thing about the Lake Winnipeg situation is it was a call to action for Western provinces. And we're using a new kind of emerging technology of flesh and blood, if you will. So this is Wicket doing a boat inspection. Now these dogs are specifically trained just for mussels at this point, and they wear little booties so they don't scratch the boat, and they're pretty quick about it. So they have a handler. There's always an inspector with the dog handler and the dog. And in this case, this was a demonstration. There were 2 mussels planted on different parts of the boat, and this dog found those mussels within 2 minutes. So really was quite impressive, and Alberta now has 3 of these dog teams that will be assisting at some of the busier stations. This is Diesel and Hannah, and it's funny, the sign, it makes me laugh every time I see it, but really we do have to be clear about what we're looking for with dogs, because it can make people really nervous, and we don't want our summer student inspectors to be dealing with drugs or guns or alcohol on the side of the road. And we're going to skip this one because I don't think we have enough time, but I'm just going to move on quickly to response. So how are we dealing with the things that are already here? So these are Prussian carp in the photo behind, doing very well, like I said. We believe they're actually mostly females that are laying eggs that can be fertilized by other species. So without creating a hybrid, which is kind of awesome if it weren't a problem. So how are we going to deal with this? Well, chances are we probably can't. It's already in the South Saskatchewan, the main stem of the Bow, all the tributaries, like I said, up to the Red Deer watershed. So we're tracking it, and we're being creative about how we message it to the public. So we're saying if you're fishing and you catch a Prussian carp, catch it, kill it. You could take it home and eat it. We've heard that they're fairly tasty, though a little bony, or you could just put it in the garbage, but we certainly do not want them going back into the water live. For flowering rush, so this is at Lake Isle, you can see it extends out, solid monoculture of flowering rush from the shoreline out about 30 feet thick. Like, this is really massive infestation. And last year we were able to go out and survey, so we know that most of the flowering rush is really in the western basin there, and we're working with local residents in 2 counties to try to come up with some control trials this summer. Probably don't have too much time to talk about these things, but those are the black bullheads that I mentioned in the beginning that were removed from the pond in Fort McMurray. We just had our first report of invasive Phragmites, which is a really nasty, tall reed that can really take over the shoreline. And then these 2 photos on the right-hand corner, we're really interested as a province in registering potash, potassium chloride, for mussel control, which would benefit all of the West and anyone who had an emergency response situation with mussels. However, it is a pretty complex initiative to try to register a pesticide. So you can ask me a question if you're interested in that. And then finally, I really want to talk about partnerships. So we could not do this as a government alone. It really requires a lot more effort than that. And like I said, I think everyone is tied together on this issue in some way. So I really wanted to call out a few of our partners here. So the dog program has been paid for almost entirely by the irrigation industry. We had a summer village at Sylvan Lake buy us a wash unit last season. Advertising, swag for the station. The Alberta Invasive Species Council has funded our Don't Let It Loose campaign. And then this big sign in the middle here, this is a permanent highway sign that we're trying to get out on all the numbered highways in the province, paid for by summer villages and, again, the irrigation industry. So we need all the help we can get. We're not made of money. We don't have dedicated funds. And every year we do better and better, but it's because we have help and support from our stakeholders. Just some ideas for things you might want to ask me about. Coordination between provinces. I really appreciate everyone who's reached out to their Saskatchewan counterparts, because there's a short window in which we can really prevent this from becoming a huge problem in the West. And for discussion, the role of municipalities in your mind. Are there things we could do together with the Don't Let It Loose campaign, with bylaws or compliance at stormwater ponds for new introductions, with control or management efforts, and with the prohibited species enforcement? So with that, these are our new trained decontaminators that respond whenever we have a mussel-fouled boat, and we have about 30 in the province who have this special watercraft training. So thank you so much for your time.
Thanks so much, Kate. That was a great update, and I'm sure people will have questions. So I see we have one already, and I encourage anyone else who has a question to start typing it in now, and we'll get to answering them. So I have a question from Brenda. Phragmites is on the Fisheries Alberta Act, but not on the Weed Control Act. Who has the authority to make someone remove it if it is growing on their property? It's not in water.
Wow, she just goes for like the hardest question out there. That is an excellent question. So honestly, we haven't had to deal with this before, where we have a species that's a plant species that's not listed on the Weed Control Act, and I think we're going to find it's not as clear. So we did that on purpose, because honestly it's so much harder to deal with species in the water. And so what we do is we do have a lot of leeway in how we deal with it, but Environment and Parks is the management agency for anything under the ordinary high water mark. So in this case, like Phragmites is not growing like submerged in the water. It's actually more of a riparian species. So we could do one of two things. We could kind of order the property owner to deal with it, or we could jump in and take over and try to deal with it ourselves. So we're not really sure. In fact, I had my first call this afternoon to figure out where we start even, and in this particular case it is, I believe, a railroad property, so it might be a little challenging, but I'm happy to tell you how it goes as we respond.
Great. So our next question is, does the province offer any resources to assist in invasive aquatics control?
An excellent question again. The answer is I wish, and I think there's a lot of us who would like to see some positive changes in this world of invasives, and I think that's one of the big gaps is, we need to be able to have, whether it's a grant fund specifically for aquatic invasives or even invasives in general, that helps municipalities or partners respond in the event of a detection. Or I would even like it to go as far as, say there's a summer village who wants to do their own inspections at a boat launch. That's great. That is awesome prevention work, and we certainly need to be able to assist. But right now, the answer is not really. We have done a couple things. So for Lake Isle, I put in a grant to our own department that would go to the Alberta Invasive Species Council, so they would become kind of the funding body, but it would be a government grant, and then they would be the project manager for the Lake Isle project. So there are creative ways to deal with it, but right now, I'm not even sure if we got the grant. So it's a bit of a gap, to be honest. I do help out in any way that I possibly can, and it does depend on budgets and time and all kinds of things. But
speaking of summer villages, I understand that some summer villages got together and applied for an Alberta Community Partnership grant, I believe it was, to do a boat cleaning station. Were you part of that? Can you speak to that a bit? And maybe there's somebody on the webinar who can talk a little bit about that. If so, just type in some background if you have it. But there are roles that municipalities can play.
Absolutely. So this, as far as I know, this was just an idea still. But we did, the Association of Summer Villages really has been an awesome partner and actually approached Municipal Affairs to really try to promote the MSI funding being eligible for aquatic invasive species projects. And I mean, showing such initiative, I'm so impressed by these guys. But yeah, there is a possibility that at least for the capital items, funding could go towards things like highway signage or windbreaks at inspection stations or other capital costs like that. So yeah, a boat cleaning station would be a really good example as well. So that would be a way to really promote the clean, drain, dry messaging, to give people the tools to do it before they leave the lake where they're supposed to. And I really applaud ASBA.
Great, and we have other good news from the town of Okotoks. The town of Okotoks was successful in obtaining a grant for goldfish control from the Alberta Conservation Association just this year. So that's good news as well.
That's great. Yeah, absolutely. And so for those of you who are dealing with the goldfish issue, I'm not going to lie, it's very challenging for us. We've never really done this before, but I'm very passionate that this behavior has to stop. And in places where we have connectivity to natural waters, it is a priority to do something about it. So I know Krista and I have been playing phone tag for like a year, but yes, let's do that again and make sure we
just to follow up with things. And if anybody has any last questions before we end today, just feel free to type them in now. So just to go back to your slide on the role of municipalities, obviously, could put up posters, don't let it loose, maybe reach out to local stores and give them the list of prohibited items. Could you talk a little bit more about bylaws and compliance at stormwater ponds and what municipalities can do to stop the goldfish before they get in?
Yeah, you bet. So in the Fisheries Alberta Act, you can't catch a fish and leave with it live. So we have that on our side. That really would prevent someone from taking live fish from one water body and putting them in another. But there aren't officers at every pond, at every lake, at every river. A lot of the urban municipalities have, which I think is really positive, Calgary and Edmonton, I know at least, have bylaws against fishing, swimming, wading, that kind of thing, because really stormwater ponds are not meant for public consumption and recreation. Like, that's actually kind of a gross prospect. So having both municipal bylaws and the ability to get compliance at that level, but also the federal the provincial laws in place, it really can help us start to enforce these better. So we don't want to see people introducing fish so that they can fish for them and potentially eat them out of stormwater ponds. That's not good for public health, that is not good for native fish, and it is not something that we ever want to encourage. I would also say that for the Don't Let It Loose, we're making signage that could be put up at ponds, so it'll have like a no dumping graphic, and then it would say don't let it loose with the hotline so people could report if they saw anything happening, like a van pull up and buckets being emptied into a pond, and lots of materials that we'd love to share with municipalities. For that list of prohibited species, it's going to be about eyes and ears. Like if you're going to the pet store anyway, maybe take a look at the tanks and see what you see. And like I said, the list is pretty big. So,
so now we have a question from Beverly Anderson. I'm not aware of funding from the Canadian partnership, but do encourage municipalities to consider using their MSI capital funds for an AIS purchase, as Kate mentioned. Yeah, and I think that the summer villages, as Beverly mentioned, have been successful in being able to apply. And if municipalities do want the posters, etc., where do they go to get that? And I'll put that back.
You can just call our hotline, or a lot of you know how to find me directly. So either way
is on the screen there to get those posters and to help spread the word.
Knowing that we had some Saskatchewan participants, I put their hotline as well, just in case. And yeah, the hotline's 24/7, and we have the ability to triage emergencies. So if we have a foul boat or someone suspects they found a mussel in the water body, it goes right to our emergency response officers. But if it also handles inquiries, requests, that kind of thing really well. So yeah,
great. And just so much for your time, I really appreciate we wrap up, AUMA. Oops. Now, just bear with me for one moment. We just had to change our slides around a little bit. AUMA does have a water management webpage, and we do have on that page a section on aquatic invasive species, where we're going to try to do our best to keep you up to date on what's happening and where you can go to get information and resources. And so if you go to water.auma.ca, the Aquatic Invasive Species page is just under watershed management. Also, we have a number of webinars coming up. One that those of you who are very interested in water may be most interested in is a follow-up webinar on provincial wetlands policy that's coming up on May 25th. And it's wetlands, why, what, when, where, how, who. No. Who, how. Anyway, I messed up the order there, but the point is that this webinar is really about answering questions that you have about wetlands, about implementation of the provincial wetlands policy, about the municipal role in wetlands. You can even ask a question about keeping aquatic invasive species out of wetlands if you want. And if you do have any specific questions about wetlands, simply send me an email. We really want to hear from you about what your questions are, and I just put my email address in the chat box on the lower left-hand side of the screen. But as you can see, we have a really wide variety of webinars coming up, from gender-based analysis to how to submit a resolution to mid-year relations. So hope to see you participate in those. As well, the main way that we keep you up to date on upcoming webinars, changes to our water site, etc., is through our weekly digest. And if you're not already subscribed to our weekly digest, I encourage you to do so by going to www.auma.ca. Just click on News and then click on Subscribe to the weekly digest. And with that, I'd just like to thank Kate again for a nice balance of frightening and hopeful. Very well done with that. And really look forward to having continued partnership with the province as we continue to deal with this issue, and to thank all of you for taking the time to be here today. And just again, I will be sending out a link to the recording of this webinar as well as to the presentations. So have a great afternoon.